Hello, I'm Malcolm West, and this is Project Management Basics, everything you need to make your project a success. This is session 4, and we'll be looking at risks. So, just like all the rest of these sessions, practical minimum jargon, free tools included, which we're going to be going through here, and typically 10 minutes. This one again will be a bit longer. Risk management's an important part of project management. We want to get a good look at it. So let's start by understanding risk. What are risks? Well, risks are things which may affect your project. They may not affect your project, they might. There's some uncertainty about those. In project management terms, if something is definitely going to affect your project, we'd call it an issue. So when you think for our risks, where we can identify them, how important they are, and we judge that by a mixture of measures. Depending on the organisation, you might use different sorts of measures and different terminology, but broadly, there's the thought of impact. Is if this thing happens, is it going to have a massive impact on us, or is it going to be a small impact? The probability, how likelihood is it? What's the likelihood of it actually happening? If it's very likely to happen, then obviously that's more important than if it's less likely to happen. And then some people will also look at proximity. How near or how far away is it? So if it might happen 20 years in the future, it's probably slightly less of an importance to us than something that might happen today, because we've got much more time to think about how we're going to address it. So some things to think about for risks there. And people often try and pull together this idea of importance or risk significance or rating by bringing together the idea of impact and probability. Some people, like I say, bring in proximity as well, but the idea of scaling them. So you might have an impact scale of 1 to 5, say, or 1 to 3, or 1 to 4, or something, 1 to 7, and a probability scale of something similar here, 1 to 5. Sometimes it's percentages, 10% or 0% to 100%, and then they range those. So here we've got saying, well, anything that's over a 4 is going to be out of green and into amber, and anything that's over a 5 by 3, so anything that's over 15 or 16, because 4 by 4 is a red as well, so anything that's over 15 would be considered red. So you can score the combination of impact and probability to determine how substantial, significant the risk is, the risk rating as we're going to call it. So let's think about risks on your project. And where are we going to find them out? What are the risks to your project? So the first thing is, back in session 1, your project, we talked about doing some research, understanding what's going on around the project, what it means technically, who the stakeholders are, what the relationships have been like, all those sorts of aspects. It's really a fundamental source of material about where things may go well or may not go so well. Many organisations that have been doing projects for a little bit longer will have this idea of lessons learned. They will have looked at the end of previous projects and said, well, doing this project we've learnt something. We've learnt that that didn't go very well, or that area there can be a problem. And often these are written down, and there'll be a log of lessons that have been learnt, and you can go and look through that and say, oh, well, that aspect might happen in my project, therefore what did they do to address that? I can do something similar. And so that's a really good source as well. Of course, discussions with people as you're working through, and as you say, there's some iteration here with planning and starting up with the project. As you're working through planning out how you're going to do on the project, people will say things about the work that they need to do and what may go well and what may not go so well, and where areas of uncertainty might lie, etc. And these are all potential aspects of risk that you might identify. So you need to be keeping your eyes open all the time. You know, sometimes people sit down and have a risk management session. They say, let's have a workshop and we'll get people around and look at what all the risks might be. And that's a great way of doing it if you've got the time and the structure and the people to do that. But actually, a lot of things are going to come up in general conversation. It's about grabbing them at the time, noting down that there is that potential risk there, so that you can then do something about it later. What should I do about risks? So, prioritize. We've just talked about working out a risk rating, a significance level for the risks, and if we know when that risk might potentially happen, we can use that information to help us decide which ones to deal with first. A small risk, which is low likelihood of happening and could happen in 10 years' time, isn't worth spending as much time on, or certainly you might do it later on, as opposed to a big risk which might happen tomorrow. Obvious, really, but you know, don't just go down them in order. Think about them by significance. And what you might try and do to address them is to reduce the impact, reduce the probability, or reduce the proximity. Reducing any of those three things is going to be helpful. Of course, just pushing them back all the time with proximity isn't really the ideal solution. You want to be reducing impact and probability if you can. You might be feeding some of that back into just your plans, giving longer lag times, change times between the end of one task and the beginning of another if you're not sure when the first one's going to finish, that sort of thing, and including changes into specifications of the work that you're going to do are good ways of addressing risk. And so when we looked at our risk rating chart earlier, we identify a risk that's up here. It's a very significant impact potentially. It's a 5. It's quite likely to happen. It's a 4. So we're up here in the red area. What we want to do is just try and reduce that. So we might be looking at measures to try and bring down the probability of it happening, but also bringing down the impact of it should it happen. And so this is a really good way of understanding these things. We'll have risks at what we call an inherent identification. When we identify the risk, how do we score it? Well, at that point it was a 20. And now, after we've put some actions in place and done some things to address it, it's now going to be a 3. We've made a significant change in the rating of that risk. And these are really good ways of understanding not only how risky the project could be, but how much you've done to address it. And as a project manager, you can be in the firing line quite often. A good way of defending what you're doing is to say, well, this project was really very risky, but I've done a lot to address that because I've taken my risk identification from this down to a managed level at this. So okay, some risks have happened, they've turned into issues, it's caused us a problem, but it's much less than it could have been. And so risk management, if you deal with it well, is a really good tool to protect you. You identified all these things, people haven't given you the wherewithal to address them. So risk management, sometimes seen as a bit of a challenge. I mean, it is a challenge, and nobody really likes to spend all their time worrying about things. But by addressing the risks early on, less of them are going to happen, and they're not going to happen in such a significant way. You can spend more of your time managing the project in a constructive, planned way, and less of it firefighting because things are just happening that you didn't anticipate. That's what risk management is about, trying to cut down all that firefighting, running around like a headless chicken, and getting on with doing the planned, ordered progression of things. Much better for your blood pressure, much more likely to have a good result, better for everybody concerned by doing that risk management. Key thing is identification and then putting in place actions to address those risks. So let's go and have a look at that in practice. So we're back in Community Edition. Again, we're going to use our planner tool. So we looked earlier at it from a planning perspective. We're going to check out that file again. And Planner, as I mentioned back in one of the earlier sessions, supports plans, risks and issues. We'll talk about the issues aspect of it later. We talked about the task aspect in the last session, and we're going to talk about the risk aspect this time. Planner will always open where you left it last time. So last time we were looking at plans, but you'll see there's a number of tabs across the top, and I can switch this to look at risks instead. And that's going to jump me into my risk register. Again, this was the template, so it's provided pretty much empty. We've just got one item in here, and we've got this laid out with at the top a summary chart showing the categories of risk that we're using and the statuses and how many risks we've got, and then we've got a list of the risks, and if we're dealing with responses, ways of addressing risks, they'll be listed at the bottom here. So again, I've got my one sort of categorized as other, my enter your risks here, template risk. So let's just double click on that and we can go in and edit it. So first tab here allows me to fill out the basic information about the risk. In a very simple sense, we can just use a description of the risk in this area called cause, which appears at the top of the tab. So I'm going to say suppliers might be late in delivery. That's my identified risk. If we're going to be a bit more sophisticated, actually, risks can generally be broken down into cause, event and effect. And if you want to do that, you can write the cause here and the event and effect here. And that just helps you really understand a little bit more about how the risk is developing. We might come back and look at that in a later session, but for the moment we're just going to keep it nice and simple, a description of the risk. I need to fill in some basic information. I need to categorize it from the available categories. You can change this list if you want to, but it's a good idea to keep a fairly standard sort of set. So this is going to be an operational risk. The status of it, is it open? I've identified it, but I've not done anything about it yet. I'm dealing with some actions. It's closed out because it's now not going to happen. I've dealt with it. So we'll leave it as open at the moment. Who's the owner? Well, we can choose the people from the list. You'll see it's the same expanded list that we used in the plan. So I'm going to pick myself out here. And you can tag these so you can group them. In this case, we don't want it to be tagged as an example anymore because it's the real one. You can sort out the date it was registered if you want to, or it'll do it automatically for a new one, or you can set the date. So that's the basic information we need to store for our risk. Like that, and we see now it's moved into the operational category. We can see who the owner is, etc. In practice, when we create a new risk, what we often do, in fact, we'll create a brand new one. So let's do add item. When we did add item in the plan, we got a task. When we do add item in a risk, we get a risk. So this is my new risk. And we'll make it a commercial one, and it's open, and again it's going to be me, and we'll see it's picked today's date and time. Now if I just close this now, it's going to tell me, oh, don't you want to rate your risk? And so here we'll see the next tab across is inherent risk, and this is that sort of matrix we were talking about earlier: impact, probability and proximity. And these are nice simple sliders. You can go through and rate your risk from the available options. We've got numbers here, they're 1 to 5 with some words associated with them. Sometimes organisations will set out their own guidance about what you might categorise as a severe risk. It might be potential to lose more than £100,000, delay the project by 2 months, significant reputational risk that reaches the press, things like that. If you're not being that sophisticated yet, you just have to set your own scale, and it helps if the same person is judging all of these. So you might find yourself where everyone throws in a set of risks. You know, anyone can add risks to the register, but it's the same person that assesses them all the time, so they're all being assessed using the same sort of scale, if you like. So I'm going to say this one is a high impact, and the probability is possible, and you'll see here immediately it's doing my calculation for me. 4 times 3, we've got a 12, and as we move these around, it's going to change those calculations to suit. We can also have proximity. You can include a score for proximity. They're all set to 1 here, so they don't affect the rating, but they can be made to do that. And so you're identifying how significant this risk is. Money is obviously usually important in projects, so if you want to, you can also set an expected value. If this risk happens, it's going to cost us £5,000. That is identifying my inherent risk. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we have 2 risk scores, inherent and residual. When you first create a risk, the residual score is always tied to the inherent, because often you create it, you mark it, you then leave it away, you come back later, you do some things to address it, and at that point you might start addressing the residual. So that's why we've got both of them created identically initially, and we've got a space here for comments, so we can write a bit more detail about what's going on with the risk if we want to, and what we're doing to address it. But for the moment, we're going to create and close. We could do create and add another, so if we're sat in a workshop adding risks, bang bang bang, we just keep working our way through the form, adding them. Add it to the list here, and we can see that's now building up. Here we've got 1 commercial, 1 operational. We can see we get some charts showing those, which is going to make more sense when we've got more than a couple of risks in, etc., and some statistics about our riskiness of the project. So we've got a nice list of those building up here. Of course, in practice, we're going to come back in and start to address them over a period of time. So I'm going to come back and say, well, that risk I identified earlier, I'm going to come back in and say, well, I'm going to do something about it now. I'm going to put some measures in place. I could just describe that here, and that's the simplest thing to do. We can run a more formal multiple responses against the risk system, but for now we're just going to say, well, these are the things we're going to do to address our risk. Therefore, I think I'm going to decouple that inherent and residual and say, well, actually, I've done something to address the impact of it and also the probability of it. So I've significantly halved it. Actually, I've also put it out so it's now medium term. And should it now happen, it might only cost me 500 quid. Like that. So in fact, as I come back in, of course, what I really want to do is also change it to now action pending. Got some things going on with it that are helping us deliver it, and we can start to therefore manage this process of coming back in and looking at them. Now these lists are orderable, so you can order things by any of the aspects that are in here, by status, by cause event, who the owners are, grouping them together, dates, levels of rating, etc., so that you can manage that process as it's going along. So identifying risks, of course, one of the things we want to do is transfer then that information we've written in our commentary about what we're going to do to address that risk. We might well come back into here and we might well say, well, one of these tasks really now needs to be a little bit longer to give us some space to get it done. Or perhaps, in fact, that's not a particularly good example. Let's take this. Let's take this one. We might say this task here has been identified as potentially risky. It might take longer than we'd anticipated. So we'll say that the predecessor, which comes after that task, we're going to put what's called a lag in it. 10 days. So it should only take that much. We're not changing the cost of doing it, but just in case it runs on a little bit, we won't start the next one for 10 days, or we'll assume it starts 10 days after that. Just gives us a bit of breathing space. And if we're trying to aim for a deadline date, sometimes putting these breathing space, these lags in between tasks, can help you with that. You're not immediately end loaded, one thing's finished, another thing's starting, etc. If you've got the time. But if you're promising somebody a delivery date for your project, you're just building, again, a technical term, contingency. You're building a bit of space and gap into that to allow you flex when things might not go exactly as you planned. You know, it's about taking the things you've identified in risk management, moving them back in and feeding them and using them elsewhere. So let's save and close that. And you'll see now in Planner, actually, the fact that we've got all these things in the same place is really useful, in that we can, in that one file, be working backwards and forwards between the content and updating it all the time. Of course, we're going to feed some of that risk information back into specifications or the documentation within the project as well. Now, while we're here, just going to have a quick look at a more complete planner file, the sort of thing you might end up doing actually in your project once you've got it all planned and you're managing through the risk aspects of it. So this is just opening for me now. And so we've got a plan here which is, let's say, a little bit more substantial. It's got probably about 30 tasks in it, some summary groupings, grouping the main areas together. You can see I've been recording my percentage complete as I've been coming down through here, and we can see where the project is against today's timeline, some tasks that are partially complete and perhaps overdue. So this one, here's today's date, here's this task, it's not complete, and it should be complete by today. So it's identifying overdue tasks for us. That's what we would call them, project terms. And we're coming up towards an obviously important part of the project where we come up towards the planning and preparation for our move, and then our move will actually happen this following week. And I've got obviously that bit more data in here, and as we see, when it comes to opening and closing these groupings, it allows me to get that sort of focus on it, so I can collapse this one. I don't really need to see the detail of that moving week, I just know it's coming up then, and it allows me to perhaps collapse some of these earlier ones as well and just focus on the thing that's happening at the moment. We were talking about that earlier. In the risk register here, you can see I've got quite a few risks in here, something like 12 or 13. Some of these have been managed with formal responses as well, and I'm ordering. The little sign here indicates that I'm ordering by residual rating. These are, of course, the risks that can still hurt me the most. So I can see the one at the top here, which that is, but I could order by inherent rating instead if I want to, by clicking on the heading here, or by status, or by who the owner is, or by the values, etc., to get a feel for those sorts of things. Obviously my table's now a bit more compact, and my charts are going to start to look a bit more reasonable as well, calculating some statistics about the budget values for the risks and all those sorts of things. Coming to talk about that a little bit more later. But one of the particular things was we talked about views, a cost view with our planning last time. We can do the same sort of view thing here. So again, if I switch to filters and views, select a view, it's a different set of views because of course it's a different type of data. So I want my top 5 high value risks, and it's going to go away and pick those out for me from all the available risks within this particular project. Pretty straightforward sort of thing to do. When you've only got 12, not particularly relevant. When you've got lots, and some people have many hundreds of risks identified in their project. Like I say, that prioritization of always coming back to the most important things is really useful. And of course this will then adjust all my charts and statistics as well for me. So I can jump back to the default or the simple one, and it'll come back into my normal view for me where all the risks are showing, and then the filter sign goes off. So pretty straightforward to do, and let's just come back to our finishing slide and wrap that up. So we just talked about risks there. We've talked about the starting process of the project and plans and risks being all rolled in together. Starts about getting our project set up and ready to start delivering, and the key aspects of that from a simplified perspective on project management are going to be planning our project ahead and doing the risk management, understanding what challenges are going to come and starting to address those in that start process, so that when we get into delivering, we've got over that hurdle of the charts we've been looking at that say as the project progresses it becomes more difficult to make changes and more expensive to make changes. So let's get all that uncertainty, if we can, out of the way at the beginning. We're moving beyond that now in the next sessions to talk about communicating, delivering, working with issues, risks that have changed into issues, reporting, and on our way towards closing. So big step forward now, moving away from that sort of starting up and into working into the ongoing delivery of the project. Thank you very much.